We have more questions than answers. We have limited time, and so let me introduce our panel this morning. On the far end of our platform this morning, we have Robert Jones, as the founding CEO of Public Religion Research Institute, a leading scholar and commenter on religion, values, and public life. We have Patton Dodd, the executive editor of Bondfire Books and a contributing editor-at-large for Pathos. We have Sarah Pulliam Bailey. Sarah has recently been named managing editor for Odyssey Networks, previously online editor for Christianity Today. And Jonathan Fitzgerald is a writer and educator, editor of Patrol Mag, and a Huffington Post religion blogger and columnist for Pathos. Would you help me welcome them this morning? I think the train just arrived. I thought as a way to begin this morning is to take kind of a 50,000-foot view, and I want to each of our panelists have a couple of minutes just to address from their perspective what they see are some of the most salient trends involving evangelicals, and especially young evangelicals in America today. And I'm going to ask Robert Jones to start this morning.
So we just released at Public Religion Research Institute yesterday a survey of younger millennials, age 18 to 25, there, and took a really hard look at values in the vote. And what we found there is among younger evangelicals, the latest numbers for white evangelical voters overall look like they're supporting Romney roughly at levels that they were supporting McCain in 2008. Three-quarters supporting Romney, only about 1 in 5 supporting Obama overall. Younger evangelical voters, we actually found 80% supporting Romney, only 15% supporting President Obama. So we don't really see a shift there. In terms of favorability, the numbers look very, very similar. White evangelical Protestants overall, 64% supporting Romney, and among younger evangelicals, we see very similar things, 63%. We see a slight, the one thing to say about the favorability numbers, we can maybe jump in later, I know everybody's thinking about Romney and evangelical support right now, is that we do see a slight dip in the people who say they have a very favorable view of Mitt Romney among the younger evangelical crowd. So it's, if you compare them to 65 and older, for example, only 12% say they have a very favorable view versus 29% of seniors, senior evangelicals, who say they have a very favorable view. So I know I've got 2 minutes, so I'm going to just very quickly just hit the highlights and come back to any of the numbers. The other places that are in the utterly boring category is immigration. And American exceptionalism, whether God has granted America a special role in human history. On the completely amazing part, I will just hit the highlights here. We can come back to them. Party ID, there's a little bit difference there. Basically, as likely to identify as Republican, a little less likely to identify as Democrat, more likely to identify as independent. So a little more independence there. But I think most interesting is breaking ranks on the culture war issues. So if you think about culture war issues being abortion, same-sex marriage, younger evangelicals are really right where their parents and grandparents were on the issue of abortion. In some cases, depending on how you look at it, maybe even a little stronger in a sort of pro-life footprint. But they're more liberal on same-sex marriage, at least at the policy level, by about 20 points. So that there's clearly a movement there on the issue of same-sex marriage, not so much on abortion. And I guess one more thing I'll point to here, and I'll wrap up my time, is this thing about economic populism. That there really is an economic populist strain in the evangelical crowd in terms of raising taxes on the wealthy, more support there than among older ones. More likely to say one of the biggest problems is not giving everyone an equal chance in life, so kind of fundamental values of equal opportunity, and more likely, interestingly enough, to say that capitalism and Christianity are at odds, to see some conflict between the values of capitalism and Christianity. So I will stop there. I'm going to leave you with one interesting one. They're more likely to go to Starbucks and Dunkin' Donuts than seniors are. And
you probably know what kind of cars they drive. And yeah, I think that was awesome. Yeah. Patton, give us your perspective.
Sure. I'm really interested always in questions of definition, kind of at the onset of conversations like this, because how evangelicals are defined and how they sort of self-define, is an interesting lens into, especially the way younger evangelicals are thinking about themselves. I remember a few years ago when Ted Haggard was president of the National Association of Evangelicals, he and his team did a lot of work around trying to sort of clarify and codify what evangelicals are and to reduce it to kind of a soundbite that they could use when talking to you. And they came up with something like, evangelicals are people who believe that Jesus is the Son of God, the Bible is the Word of God, and you must be born again, which is both sharp and way too broad. You know, it's this big tent aspect that allows for 50 Shades of evangelicalism, and many more than that, actually. And I think that these questions are fascinating, and those kinds of definitions are problematic in part because they're really definitions that have to do with core religious identity, maybe more suited to kind of religious studies discourse. But the way that evangelicals normally get talked about in the public square is more of a social studies discourse. They're defined in terms not of the content of their religious beliefs, but in terms of the content of their civil or civic behavior. Last week I attended a conference with a lot of young, up-and-coming evangelical leaders in Denver, and one of the speakers was a pastor and writer named Skye Jethani. Is that how you say his name? Skye Jethani. And he gave this really eloquent address to this conference talking about the ways that evangelicals have been defined in the public square and the ways that they've defined themselves and kind of set the terms of the conversation. And he talked about how they have, since the late 1970s, framed their participation in public life in terms of values. And Brad used this word when he was making his introduction, that we are here to sort of make claims on values and sort of our values versus their values, especially over matters like gay rights. And that is sort of Jethani talked about how that's sort of a winner-take-all mentality. And he said instead that the conversation ought to shift to be about identity. So the question isn't like whose values will win the day in the public square. The question really is whose identity can be accommodated in the public square. Which identities can we accommodate? And in a democracy, the answer to that should be everyone's. And so he was talking about changing the terms of the conversation so that we're not in this winner-take-all mentality that sort of over-defines evangelicals as being a certain kind of thing. Instead, making it, again, a conversation about identity where your question isn't, the question that they're asking and then what's motivating their social behavior is not who values will win, but again, whose identity can be accommodated, and therefore, because the answer to that question is everyone, then that would, he would say, motivate us to make sure that everyone has the same freedoms that we have, and which would allow them to sort of be sort of exactly who they are as evangelicals in all their diversity. So I'm seeing a lot of this kind of thing. If you look at young evangelical bloggers, and even if the shifts aren't as deep in terms of their commitments, like Robert said, there's been a huge call for a change in discourse and a change in public behavior, and I think we're going to be hearing a lot more about that in the years to come.
Great, thanks, Pat.
Yeah. So I have a quick story to tell. When I was a student at Wheaton College, I took a class called Sociology of Evangelicalism. If you can believe you can actually take a class in that. And we went around the room and we talked about, our professor asked, tell us where you came from and where you are now. And nearly every student could say, oh, I was born Methodist, or oh, I was born in a non-denominational megachurch, but no one could really say where they were at that moment. And I think that was, our professor was like, this is evangelicalism. A lot of people know where they're from, but not a lot of, especially 20-somethings, don't know how to define where they are right now. You might catch them in transition. People are evolving and trying to figure out, can I be evangelical and be X, Y, or Z? Can I be evangelical and be Anglican? Can I support, or same-sex marriage? Certain things that I think younger evangelicals are still sorting out. And then once they figure that out, once they find a church they really love, do they call themselves Presbyterian? Do they call themselves Anglican? Or do they self-identify as evangelical? So I think, when we're doing polls and we're trying to capture that evangelical label, it's hard because you won't see a lot of people I would consider my peers self-identifying even as born again or even as evangelical, but when you ask them how often they attend church, what do they believe about the Bible, what do they believe about Jesus, you might be able to decide, oh, you're kind of like an evangelical, and they may look at you with like this horrified look, like, no, I don't like Bush, you know? And so what I think, the other thing that I think is happening right now is that there's kind of a generational thing going on, and it's not just, oh, you're a millennial evangelical. The question is, were you raised evangelical, and where are you now? And I think the generational, when you say second generation evangelical, it's very different. One of my colleagues at Christianity Today, she's my age, and she went to Calvin College, I went to Wheaton College, and she has this just excitement about evangelicalism, and she told me, she was like, yeah, I don't have any baggage from my day, because she didn't grow up evangelical. She uncovered it or discovered it at Calvin College, and I think that has a huge impact as to how excited you are about evangelical, especially if you became or converted at a young age, at 4 years old, and you grow up in evangelicalism. You don't have a cool testimony to tell. Evangelicals love their testimony telling. And so if you don't have a cool testimony, if you don't have that, like, I was doing drugs and now I'm a Christian, no, I actually grew up and I was kind of a good kid, and there's not a cool story to tell there. So I think there's a lot of angst among younger evangelicals, like, where do I fit in this sphere? And there's a lot of frustration not being able to uncover the old, like, nobody, if you said C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, these are things younger evangelicals grew up with. They're not uncovering cool, like, oh, what is this Born Again book by Charles Colson? It's like, that was the literature that they grew up on. So there isn't that excitement. So I think when you ask somebody if they're evangelical, it's interesting if you find out if they grew up evangelical too. The final thing I wanted to point out was, in my last days at Christianity Today, I was working on this piece called 50 Women to Watch. And we asked evangelical leaders to identify women. We asked probably 150 leaders to tell us women who they were watching, who they considered to be influential in evangelicalism. And I think what you can see if you look on the cover of this month's Christianity Today, you have a lot of old school, what I call old school evangelical, and then you have sort of new and up-and-coming evangelicals. So you'll see Johnny Erickson Tata. She's represented for a lot of evangelicals. She's a quadriplegic and she's had breast cancer. She represents for evangelicals someone who has suffered very deeply. But then you look at Margaret Feinberg. She's an up-and-coming evangelical. I don't know her faith background, but I'd be curious to know if she's a second-generation evangelical. So it's not just about, oh, you're in your 20s or you're in your 30s and you're evangelical. The question is, did you grow up in an evangelical home as well? And I think that shapes a lot of evangelical views and self-identification.
Hey, I'm really happy to be here. I've been following the conference for years on Twitter, and so with that in mind, I was hoping that somebody would just quote me and then put a hashtag that says RNA 2012, just because I've been so jealous of that happening all these years, and I'd love to see it. It'd be great. Thanks to Faith Village for just do it seriously for having us here. This is a great conversation. So this 50 Shades of Evangelicalism thing. The title actually comes from a piece I wrote for Religion Dispatches, and I should be more clever, but I sent in the piece to the editor as Shades of Evangelicalism. Why didn't I see the 50 there right in front of me? I don't know, but Evan at Religion Dispatches did, and appended the 50, and all of a sudden we had sort of an SEO title, which is really nice. But this piece started for me reading. Did you all read Timothy Noah's piece in his Language Cop column in the New Republic, probably back in March or April, about the use of the word Christian? And he was sort of ranting about a movie, I can't even remember what it was, that was coming out that was called a Christian movie. Everybody was, this is a Christian movie. And he, asked the question like, well, what Christians? I think something like, statistics, so bad at it. So let's say 80, it's not right. 80% of Americans identify as Christian. Are they all going to see this movie? No, of course not. So he wanted to narrow the term a little bit. Can we say conservative Christian, or can we say evangelical Christian? Maybe it's an evangelical Christian movie. So I'm reading that and I'm thinking, yeah, good. That's a really important distinction to make. But I think it actually has to go a little bit further, because when you talk about evangelical, well, which evangelical? We've heard a lot about the different sort of varieties of evangelical that we all come across based on age or, background, or I think it's a great point as to whether or not they were raised in the church or not. So this really does sort of bring out all these different shades. For me, the sort of reason why I wanted to, and I think it's important to draw a distinction between all of these, is because I was raised in the church, and not until 2004, the 2004 elections, did I know that I was considered evangelical. We were charismatic, we were born again, we were weird because we were in Boston, and there's not a lot of us up there. But I didn't know I was an evangelical, and the moment I started to realize that that's what people were calling me and my tribe, I said, no, actually, that doesn't fit me at all. I don't look like that kind of evangelical or this kind of. So it started me on this sort of, well, what am I kind of thing. And that's when I connected with David Sessions at Patrol, and they were sort of using a term which I love, mostly because I think most of you hate, post-evangelicalism. I love it because it's so sort of tongue-in-cheek and snarky, and I had a religion professor sit down with me one time and say, so what do post-evangelicals believe? And I said, no, that misses the point entirely. It's not about what they believe. It's about what they don't believe and what they were and are no longer. And so, I live with this sort of question: is how do I identify myself now? I don't identify as evangelical. So post-evangelical, we can say that this is something that I was, and now I'm something else, and maybe that's all that we can say. Maybe all I have in common with other former evangelicals is that we were evangelicals once. So I think I'll leave it there so we can move on. But my phone is vibrating like crazy, so I think you're doing it. Thank you.
Mine is too in my pocket, so you're getting a response. That's fantastic. Well, we're somewhat pressed for time this morning. There's so many questions. One of the recurring themes I hear in our panel this morning is frankly a kind of ambivalence about evangelical as an identity term. And we see this a lot as well. We ran an essay contest recently on our site asking people to write along the theme of, hi, I'm blank and I'm an evangelical. Whether you like the term, don't like the term, whether you still use the term, used to use the term, don't now. And it was interesting, the range of responses. Everything from a very expected conservative championing of the term for proclaiming of the gospel and classic theological definitions of what it means to be evangelical, to people who said that they used to be but they're not anymore. We even had one response, a man from Connecticut named Ben Newbeau who said, hi, I'm Ben, I'm evangelical. I'm also Jewish, gay, and a Democrat, and I'm an evangelical. And then he went on to unpack that. And his whole life experience as a teen in Connecticut of having evangelicals reach out to him when no one else would and embrace him and teach him, and how, despite he was often in conflict with his tribe, that he still would not forsake his tribe and that he still felt welcomed and included. And so one of the questions I would ask our panel then is, do you think evangelical is still a valid term, especially when it comes to research, to speaking monolithically about this group of people? We're living in a world where increasingly people choose very personal and subjective terms for religious identity. I'm a Christ follower. I'm a Christian. I'm something other than the typical research categories. And frankly, what's interesting is that African American Protestants usually are not included in the white evangelical research stats, which kind of skews things a little bit too. So talk about that, about evangelical as a term of identity.
All right, so I'm going to be the great defender of definitions. So, in sociology and political science, definitions are necessary, right? There's no way to measure anything if you can't define it, right? So, but by their very nature, they make a mess of what's a really complex situation on the ground. They draw lines. Sometimes they look, the lines on the ground are much fuzzier than the lines that get drawn from sociological or political science point of view. But just so everybody's clear, the definition that we use, that Pew Research uses, Gallup uses, is basically a self-identifying term. And so that's what happens, right, with social science research, is that and the real what it comes down to is, so it's race. So you have to identify as Christian, you have to identify as Protestant. We have ways of getting those people even who don't know they're Protestant, because there's a fair number of those folks who just know they're not Catholic. But then we do race, non-Hispanic, white is the kind of identifier on race and ethnicity. And then the real dividing question that we and a lot of other most social science uses is the question of whether you are a born again or evangelical Christian. And we use both of those terms precisely because if we only asked, are you an evangelical Christian, we'd have a fair number of folks opting out, right? So we ask, actually, do you consider yourself an evangelical or born-again Christian? And one just little anecdote from this, we did a survey with Mercer University a few years ago in the southeast United States of evangelicals, well, actually of all religious people in the southeastern United States, and we decided to keep open the born-again or evangelical tags to ask everyone this question. And we ended up with something like 20% of people that we would have classified if we asked them by denomination would have been mainline. So like United Methodists in particular are the great offenders in the South of this term, right? So that we had like 1 in 5 United Methodists in the South claiming to be evangelical or born again, which actually put them sociologically in the evangelical camp, whereas if you classify them by denomination, they'd be in the mainline Protestant camp. So this is one little anecdote of kind of the messiness on the ground. So,
I guess I know there are reasons why for research you have to ask those questions. I think if you're asking somebody as a reporter, I think you should ask it differently. I think you should ask at least 5 or 10 questions before you try to figure out whether somebody's an evangelical. Ask them church attendance, ask them how would you describe, without a leading question, born again or not? Because even the phrase born again, I do not hear that phrase anymore at all among my peers. I don't know if you guys are similar, and then post-evangelical, that's interesting and all of that, but why not just call yourself mainline Christian or mainline Protestant, right? Because that's where you go to church. So I would ask, church attendance where, maybe even ask, do you self-identify as an evangelical? And a lot of people are uncomfortable with that phrase, so don't put it upon them. That's kind of my advice as you're reporting on this.
Well, I guess I'll respond since it sounds like it was a challenge. Post-evangelical, why? Because it's funny, I guess, is the reason. To be honest, no. So, if I'm serious and you want to know, I attend Episcopal church, so I could call myself Episcopal. But what I like about the sort of self-identifying as post-evangelical is this idea that we share something. We all have something in common. You remember that crazy youth group thing we did? Yeah, you did that too. I did that. That's nice for us, And so it's probably not a helpful term for people outside of that circle, but within the circles, it's really nice to sort of share that, we all went to the crazy camp together and sang songs, So I guess that's the kind of reason, but I don't know how helpful it is in terms of a sociological category.
So it's not for you. It's not so much a diss on evangelicalism. It's just a identifier of your journey has moved on a bit.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Okay, very good. Well, we're limited in time, but I do want to give you a chance to ask a question. If there's a burning question this morning that you would like to ask this panel, we'd like to give you a few minutes to explore that. Yes, sir. I could respond. What do you have, a burning response?
Go ahead. I'll hear from you first.
Well, and that conversation has happened in several places. It's happened at Patheos and several others. The classic theological definition, David Bebbington did the classic, evangelical quadrilateral of biblicism, crucicentrism, activism, and conversionism. I'm sorry. And so that's kind of the theological criteria. And generally, I think historians and theologians would say that's what it means to be an evangelical, regardless of what social position you may take on something. People argue, though, that if you take any social position apart from this core tradition, then you violated biblicism. And that's where the rub gets. So the argument has been, how long can you self-identify as an evangelical? I think every religious tradition has that question. Do you have loyal adherents, or do you have those who've moved outside the fold? And in some sense, that's kind of an internal tribalism thing, but it does beg the question of religious identity and how one appropriates a term.
I was going to say, good answer.
Is the question, I mean, part of it is a distinction between, is Brian McLaren being called an evangelical in some story that where the writer may not have thought very carefully about what that term might mean, how it's being used in that context, or is he trying to self-identify? And is Matt only telling him you can't self-identify that way any longer? Maybe he was. I don't think, is that what he's doing? If you support gay marriage, I don't see any sense to that at all, because there's, I mean, you just quoted statistics of there being movement on this very issue. Maybe not as strong as has been stated, but there is some about these hot-button issues like gay marriage and abortion. You want to speak to that?
Let's get the number real quick. Yeah, so I think people are these are insider debates about like what's legitimate, what's not. I mean, these are always perennial issues of like where are the dividing lines. But just one thing to note is that if you look at evangelicals who are 65 and older, 80% oppose allowing gay and lesbian couples to marry. And that number even if you go just under 40, so 18 to 39-year-olds, so 58%. Opposed, but that's not 80, right? And so, one thing to say is that you'd be defining out of being an evangelical, a good 35% of the under 40 crowd, if you make that a litmus test for defining what's legitimately evangelical.
I just want to add that I live in Colorado Springs, so I know from evangelical, just by virtue of my hometown. And I will say that this conversation happens a lot among certain kind of thoughtful evangelicals in Colorado Springs. Like, how do we associate with this term? And I have been in conversation with a lot of people in that city in the last few years who are shifting on this issue of gay marriage, and who and still I think would self-identify as evangelical, although they would disclaim it up and down as being complicated. But they would identify with some sort of core aspects of evangelicalism. And would want to still, name themselves as such, even as their positions on this kind of thing are shifting, no matter what Mattingly says.
Yeah. Well, can I make a quick distinction? I think there's a difference between supporting same-sex marriage from a political point of view and gay ordination or gay blessings in your church. They're totally separate issues, and you want to distinguish between like the political and the church question.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting because we see, and again, this is anecdotally, and Robert can do research on it, but we see young people who not necessarily have left their core evangelical social values, but they're changing the way they apply those in the public sphere. So that what's right for me doesn't necessarily have to be a matter of law for everyone else. And I think we're seeing that more and more, that their application of their religious values to the social sphere is changing. In the back, sir.
I mean, that might be the crux. Sorry about my glass. The crux of what's changing is that I think young evangelicals have grown up with this sense that their participation in the public square has kind of been defined for them, and a lot of it has to do with saying you're wrong, calling out values, and trying to make more space for your own values, and that's the shift that I was trying to describe earlier, and that Skye Jethani was sort of calling for. Was you could still be evangelical, self-identify that way, and be proud of it, and want to have a rich evangelical community, and yet, this kind of values war stuff that's been happening has defined us too much, like in that mode, that's who we are, that's what makes up the sort of content of our being, and instead, we should be able to move towards, accommodating lots of different points of view and standing up for them, and that's what the war should be over, is making sure that everyone has the same freedoms. And that's a massive, massive shift.
I think it's an interesting discussion. I've run across some bloggers that would include repudiating heresy as a core evangelical value. And that exactly speaks to that. And that is in our history, that there are those for whom evangelical identity, if you don't repudiate heresy, then you're not really true to your core values. But there are many now that say, well, that's not really essential. I'm more confessional, then I am looking for conflict. And so we bear testimony, but we don't necessarily hunt down everybody else. So this is a very one more quick question, yes.
I'm going to make a general point on my way to that one. And one of the other markers that I think feeds into a lot of these shifts is the demographics of younger evangelicals are shifting. And I'm even talking about inside the white non-Hispanic world. So they're less likely to live in rural settings, more likely to live in urban settings. They're also, interestingly enough, more likely to call themselves working class than middle class among the younger evangelical crowd. So it's not like all upwardly mobile hipsters, but it's a very interesting group. I kind of said, this kind of the Starbucks versus there. But the other thing is that they're much more likely to have diverse social networks, right? So more likely than older evangelicals have a close friend, or even a family member who is gay or lesbian, much more likely to have a close friend or family members who have a different race than they are. So there's a much more cosmopolitan kind of worldview and kind of interaction there. And Latino evangelicals are a really interesting group, very, very fast growing. They're still relatively small, speaking, but they are a very fast growing group. And they tend to look fairly consistently like white evangelical Protestants on political issues. So in terms of their political identity and their position on the issues, the one outstanding place where that's not true is on the issue of immigration.
Well, we're going to have to wrap things up this morning. I appreciate so much you joining with us, and we hope the conversation continues. All of us will be around if you would like to pursue more questions that perhaps you didn't get to answer. The conversation always continues online, as we very well know. We provided some materials on your table today about FaithVillage.com and what we do. There's a digital press kit on the flash drive. Please take one from the table as a gift from us to you. But also, we'd love for you to explore this conversation. FaithVillage.com is a place where this conversation seeks to happen, whether it's evangelicals, right, center, left, traditional, centrist, or modern. It's a place where we want to have this conversation. So thank you very much, and have a wonderful morning.